It is the speech that is given out by every neoconservative organization in Washington as the classic statement of what American foreign policy priorities were then and should have been. That Mr. Clinton didn't do anything about it and needn't necessarily be held to his charge. He didn't do that much about al-Qaeda either, except for bombing the wrong target in Sudan, lying about it, letting Osama bin Laden get away while looking better, and pursuing a Nobel Peace Prize for a futile Oslo process. If you don't believe that, you might be willing to believe that Afghanistan is less safe now, I think I quote Mark Tanner correctly, less safe now than it was when the Taliban was in power and it was the hinterland country for al-Qaeda. This is Afghanistan which for the first time in a very long time has its women folk going to school, is promulgating a constitution that was published yesterday, is building a road system between Kandahar and Kabul. It's the roads that allow warlordism, ladies and gentlemen. A warlord is someone who controls a stretch of non-highway road, and which has largely expelled and is killing every day members of the al-Qaeda and the Taliban militia. To say that we're less safe there would be the equivalent of saying that we were safer from al-Qaeda before September 11th, 2001, when unknown to us, but apparently known to our vaunted intelligence services, which have suffered so grievously from the Bush administration, known to the CIA and the FBI, though not passed on to one another or to the civilian leadership, was the fact that a secret army was being formed inside our borders with support from foreign regimes. That was known then. It just wasn't considered to be worthy of any serious action. The security we enjoyed when al-Qaeda and the Taliban controlled Afghanistan and Saddam Hussein controlled Iraq, when it must be admitted fewer Americans were then being killed and there was less violence, was the security of a fool's paradise. Is there anyone who thinks that we have not been for some time at war with the forces of jihad and the totalitarian states that underwrite them? Is there anyone who really thinks that the relationship between the Ba'ath Party and the Fedayeen Saddam and the jihadists who are now coming into Iraq or re-entering Kurdistan began only when the United States intervened? Nobody who studied the question could believe this for a second. The Ansar al-Islam group formed in Kurdistan under Saddam's protection. The subventions of money and propaganda support to jihad forces all around the world were an increasingly conspicuous feature of the Ba'athist regime. And as for inspections, I'd refer you to the work of Dr. David Kelly, a very distinguished former British arms inspector, whose regrettable suicide has embarrassed the Blair government so much, and to an article he wrote, only just published, alas, just before his death, saying that anyone who wanted inspections in Iraq had to be for regime change, because without a regime change there could be no verification. A perfectly commonsensical point. Now Iraq has been disarmed and hasn't yet been fully inspected, but is being inspected at last. And everyone is saying that they're resentful and surly about this extraordinary outcome. An outcome that, I will remind you, has forced the Iranian mullahs to accept mediation from at least two foreign ministers who wouldn't have bothered with it before, Monsieur de Villepin and Mr. Fisher, in alliance with Jack Straw, has forced them to accept mediation, United Nations supervision and inspection. Does anybody believe that the mullahs in Iran would be consenting to this level of intervention in their covert nuclear program if it were not, one, for the fact that the rival, the deadly enemy against whom they built this weaponry, has been removed and disarmed, first, and second, that a fairly useful pedagogic example has been afforded them of what will happen in case of defiance, that if they bluff, they will be taken seriously. Who objects to that? Who would feel safer if they'd gone on developing their program and lying about it as they were doing until a couple of months ago? If we have to refer this matter, as under the rubric of this meeting, not known to me today actually, until today, but never mind, the slightly fatuous rubric of our own self-regard and our own safety, never mind, take it at its own face value. Yes, you are safer for the disarmament of Iraq. Yes, you are safer for the coming disarmament of Iran. Yes, you are safer for the physical destruction of the Taliban bin Laden regime in Kabul. And yes, you have President Bush to thank for it, and not President Clinton, and not George Tenet, and not the FBI, all of whom allowed these developments to occur and left us defenseless in our own hometowns under open skies. Now, the David Kay inquiry, the reports of which seem to me to be printed completely upside down. They said, David Kay discovers no shelves with neatly arranged stockpiles of weaponry. What does the David Kay report actually say? I trust everyone here has read at least some of it before coming along. The David Kay report finds first evidence of an enormous and consistent concealment program. Call me old-fashioned if you will. By my logic of induction, a concealment program is evidence in itself. No one has a concealment program to conceal nothing. The scientists were threatened. 2 of them were shot for even considering cooperation with the earlier inspectors. Not that I think the Blix team was really looking, but in case they were looking, scientists were shot and intimidated and their families threatened with extermination if they cooperated. Designs and plans for missiles have been found by the K team, who are only a quarter of their way into their work, that far exceed, by thousands of miles, the limits that Saddam Hussein was allowed for the range of his missiles. Toxins have been found concealed in the private homes of scientists, in one case buried in a garden. It's quite extraordinary how far the depravity of the Saddam Hussein regime has been exposed in this matter of weapons of mass destruction by the Kay report. That was my 1 minute. I don't need another one.
7 minutes, Mark Danner. I think we're all faced with a question here, which is, are we citizens or are we dupes? Do we have the ability to make distinctions? Can we read the newspaper, listen to the news, listen to our leaders speak to us, and make judgments on our own? The evidence of the last few months gives us some pause, it seems to me, when we consider these questions. Christopher is clearly one of the 69% of Americans who the Washington Post claims believe that Saddam was behind 9/11.
If I had thought that, I would have said so. And I did have a spare minute.
Well, I would have been grateful if you had said it explicitly.
Then I would have had time for that too.
Well, I shall say it for you in any event.
Come to do.
You know, George Bush, a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, I think, actually came out after a particularly egregious performance by his vice president on one of the network shows, and came out and said, no, we have no evidence that Saddam Hussein was behind 9/11. I found this fascinating, that he felt himself obliged to say this, because, of course, the administration, over months and months, of very clever statements, very clever terminology, very cleverly dancing around the issue, was able to convince the great majority of Americans that, in fact, these 2 threats were the same thing. These Americans who were shocked by 9/11, as everyone was, who thought, here are our fellow citizens being killed while they're having their morning coffee, were perfectly willing to support a war against Iraq that they felt was replying to that immediate threat. Now, this kind of clever obfuscation is still being employed every day. We've seen a little of it from this stage. The fact is, when Christopher says Saddam was disarmed, Saddam wasn't disarmed. These weapons have not been found. I'll tell you another way that Saddam has not been disarmed. All across Iraq today, there are scores of enormous fields, the size of 1, 2, 3 football fields, filled with conventional weapons. Now, up till last March, these fields were guarded by soldiers, Iraqi soldiers. Now they're not guarded by anyone. No Iraqi soldiers, because the army, in America's wisdom, was dissolved. No American soldiers, because there aren't enough of them in country to do it. If you like, you can drive up to one of these depots with a pickup truck or something larger, pick up as many missiles as you like. That one that shot down the helicopter the other day, a day in which, by the way, I flew out of Baghdad on a conventional plane, that missile was probably simply picked up at an arms depot that isn't being guarded. This was a war to prevent weapons from getting in the hands of terrorists.